Well, I'm also technologically illiterate, and some of the people working here know just the depth of my illiteracy in terms of my resistance to using email and things like this. So let me just repeat, I'm very happy and honored to have the invitation to come this afternoon. Very grateful to all of you to be willing to spend some time on such a beautiful day indoors discussing Pali poetry and learning about it. And what I hope we'll do together is to spend some time talking about how to read it so that all of you can read it for yourselves. I'm also very grateful for the kind introduction and invitation himself from Bhikkhu Bodhi to come today. It's my first visit here, and it's been just a wonderful day, and I hope it's the first of many times that I'm here, that I'm able to come here. Let me just give a little bit of both background to these poems, the Therigatha, but then also to introduce different ways that we can think about how to read them. On the side, let me just say, my voice is not always like this. It's just a little bit softer, or the way it is today, because I've been traveling, and as all of you know, that when you're on airplanes, you're prone to catch some minor colds, but just to say to you, I'm in no discomfort at all. It's a physical condition that happens to me quite often. One of the things I say about it, it's an ideal physical condition because you don't feel bad at all, but you get a lot of sympathy from other people. So even though my voice may sound like I'm straining, I'm not at all. It's just the way it sounds today. So Bhikkhu Bodhi has already said a few words about the Therigatha. Literally what the title means is the Gatha, the songs of the elder women, the Theri. What we might say, to refer to the English poet William Blake, these are songs of experience. And that what they are the poems that are describing the accomplishments and the experiences of what are the first senior Buddhist women that we have. We can say that what is interesting and grabs our attention about the Therigatha is how many times this word first seems to attract itself to them. They are the poems of the first Buddhist women in the way that we've received them. They are also, what we could say, windows into or some insight into the practices, the lives of the first Buddhist women. They are also some of the oldest poetry in the Indian subcontinent that we have. Not quite the oldest, but some of the very oldest. And that when we read them, what we can see is the formation of a great literary tradition in South Asia that are there. I don't know why this is going in and out. What comes to be a great tradition of poetry in Sanskrit and other languages across South Asia can see in some ways are taking shape in the poems of these first Buddhist women. The other thing that we can say is that the Therigatha are probably some of the earliest poetry of women that we have in the world. And that in and of itself is part of what attracts our attention to them. These poems of experience are part of, have entered into the scriptural collections of the Theravada school that's now found in Sri Lanka and in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Burma, Laos, and Cambodia. In the past, when these poems were collected together, the Theravada was also found in South India. And so what we could say is that the lives of these women are being preserved in areas that the women themselves probably did not live in, but that they were living in India. And then their poems were handed on in this one particular school of Buddhism. This poetry of the women is not found in the scriptural collections of other Buddhist schools. So it's not found in China, it's not found in Tibet, it's not found in any of the Mahayana. But what we do have is that within the Theravada, this collection of the songs of experience of these women were preserved. You can also say that the way that they're preserved, we can tell that from the language that they are translations. So that the Pali that I translated is already a translation from other languages that we don't know what they were. But what we do know is that the great commentator on the Therigatha, Dhammapala, who wrote in about the 6th century in South India, he was already struggling with the language of the Therigatha because of the features of it were odd because of the translation itself. And so what you have then is that we can't say that we're having the direct accounts of what these women may have said. But they are poems that have been reworked in translation, and we don't know the degree of other kinds of reworking. Modern scholars, people like myself, we're trained to be suspicious of what people tell us. I grew up having my mother always saying to me, whenever I would voice my opinion about something, that and $1 gets you a ride on the subway, meaning that it's not worth anything. But I would always be raising questions. Why do we have to do this? Why does it have to be this way? This is what scholars do. So it is, say, a feature of modern scholarship to have doubts. Are we sure that these are actually the poetry of women? And we can't say that we're sure. But there's ways in which sometimes where we can say, oh, the witness of the tradition has been that these are the expressions of experience by early Buddhist women. Can say that modern women, when they're reading it, oftentimes say, oh, this is a voice of a woman that I recognize. But we just have to acknowledge something of that doubt, that we don't know exactly who wrote these poems. I myself am conservative in many ways, and I would just say I follow the tradition almost always. And I follow what the commentators have said that say these are the voices of the poetry of these great Buddhist women. And what I want to do today, I'm going to sketch out 2 different ways of reading the poetry, and we'll really concentrate on just one of them. And so for me, what the poems of the early Buddhist women are is that they're great poetry. And that poetry shouldn't be read as historical evidence. It should be read as poetry. And we should find ways in which we allow this poetry to speak to us in our own time. And not only as giving us evidence about what certain women and some men were like many, many centuries ago. But it's important to just acknowledge that it is a way of reading these texts as evidence for how women in particular lived in a relatively distant past. And there's much of interest in that. And one of the things that surprised me when I began to work on the text is certain themes that came up. As poetry, I wouldn't say that the poems are particularly Buddhist in their content. Where you say, oh, here's this typical Buddhist doctrine that is there. They are very human documents. They don't go into doctrinal discussions. There's ways in which you can see them within a Buddhist framework, and that they are clearly Buddhist, but they're not doctrinally heavy laden. Something else is happening there. What is interesting to me, too, is that these are women who are ordained, and they speak about how they were ordained. There are also women who had become enlightened, and they speak about how they became enlightened. They don't go into very much about what monastic life was for them, about the rules and the habits of how they lived together. They don't go into very much about, at all really, as far as I can see, of discussions about what kinds of meditation they might have done, what kinds of reflections they might have done. They speak about how happy they are at the freedom they achieved, but they don't say, I did this meditation or I did that. What this strikes me, what is important about this in terms of historical information, is that it might be that when we read texts about monastic life, the rules of monastic life, it gives us a wrong impression about how it was that the early Buddhist community organized itself. What is very, very striking when you read the poems all the way through is how much the theme of friendship between women comes up. what is clear is that the community of women that are being described are that they are women who think of themselves as friends with each other. And that they also, many of them, were friends before they ordained. That they were friends as lay people, and then they entered into the monastic order because their friend was getting ordained too, and they continue to be friends in the monastic order. The other thing that was very striking is that there's themes of how some of the women who found themselves in the monastic order, joined it, were attracted to it, that they found themselves living in communities among women who had similar kinds of experiences as they did. The most notable for me of this was communities of women who were mothers who had lost a child to death. And that what they found in their heartbreak and trying to overcome like the difficulties of this, that having someone else who had suffered the same thing as them was what drew them to this life, and that they lived together in these communities. For a historian, this is a very interesting kind of observation that I think the texts give us information to. What we could say is that within the institutional structure of the Buddhist monastic order, there were other kinds of arrangements of living that people were engaged in, that people found themselves drawn to each other because of shared experiences that belonged to their past and the mutual support that they could give to each other. In many ways, it's not, reading it, it doesn't seem all that much different than what it's like when, in today's world, when we see people who are terminally ill joining into support groups with each other to help each other to deal with situations that the rest of the world doesn't have to encounter in the same way that they do. I will say that the text itself doesn't draw attention to this. When you first pick up the text, it seems that the text is just ordered, the poetry is ordered in very, very arbitrary ways, according to the length of the poems. If the poem is one verse long, it's in one section, and it keeps on getting longer and longer. So it seems that it's just an anthology that someone put together in an arbitrary way. But when you're reading them together, what you see is that the women who are juxtaposed next to each other oftentimes have something that has put them next to each other because of shared experience, because of friendship, because of kindness of one towards another. And so that, as historical information, to say that one of the great Buddhist virtues in history, for me, probably has been friendship. And that the monastic life, the religious life, depends on lives of friendship between people. And that what we see in the poetry is testimony between people over the significance of friendship and the kindness of strangers that turns into friendship that is key to the religious life for these women. I will say, and we'll come back to this, is that for someone like myself who's interested in the history of literature in South Asia, and what I can say is that this literary theory on literature, literary theory in South Asia on what makes poetry is some of the most sophisticated in the world. What's particularly interesting about these poems is that before the theory, we see examples of people writing poetry that centuries later would become theorized in particular kinds of ways. We'll come back to this, but let me just give one kind of what will be an important thing. In South Asia, what poetry is referred to is crooked speech. When people are trying to say, well, what makes human speech poetry? It's not that it's in verse, although this happens to be in verse. It can be in prose. But what makes it poetry, literature, is that it says what it wants to say indirectly. And so it's that crookedness, that it says something not explicitly, but is depending on you to know what is being said, is what makes literature or poetry, use of human language as literature comes from this crookedness. Later theories would be is that what makes poetry is our awareness of this secondary meaning that is not said, but we understand is the real meaning. And one of the things that we could say is that this is just an ordinary feature of human life. We are always speaking to each other in ways in which we don't say exactly what we mean, but we count on other people to understand, oh, this is what I'm saying, and the pleasure in saying things that other people will recognize that you're saying something quite indirectly. One example I still laugh about, and it's going away. For many of us in this room of a certain age, we came of age in a world in which you could call 411, that was known as information, to find out someone's phone number. You can still do that. For me right now, I end up using Google, the omniscient Google, to look up. I didn't know that you could still call 411 and whether people would still call it information. But I just remember I was asking someone to do something for me, and they said yes, and then he just said to me, give me the 411. And so one of the things that depends on is that you have to know that 411 stands for what's called information. And so instead of saying, give me the information, you could just say, oh, give me the 411. And then what you would immediately say, oh, I understand what you mean. So that way of kind of saying things indirectly gives us pleasure, but also allows us to say a lot more than we say. And that this is part of what makes poetry poetry. And so part of what it means to read the verses of the nuns is to try to find out ways of what are they trying to say to us that they may not be saying directly. So that's what I want to spend the rest of our time together doing, a number of different exercises, and I hope everyone has a copy of a handout that I prepared. There will be 3 different ways of thinking about how to read the poetry to make sense of what they're doing. So the first is from a woman named Patachara. And it just says, it's found in the collection of the Therigatha under poems with 5 verses. When you read the collection together, what you'll see in it is that Patachara is the leader of groups of women, all of whom have had a child die. And we'll come back to this in a second. Let me just read out loud the poem that is by Patachara. Furrowing fields with plows, sowing seeds in the ground, taking care of wives and children, young men find wealth. So, why have I not experienced freedom when I am virtuous and I do what the teacher taught, when I am not lazy and I am calm? While washing my feet, I made the water useful in another way. By concentrating on it, move from the higher ground down. Then I held back my mind, as one would do with a thoroughbred horse. And I took a lamp and went into the hut. First I looked at the bed, then I sat on the couch. I used a needle to pull out the lamp's wick. Just as the lamp went out, my mind was free. You can see in the poem what I mean by a song of experience. She's telling the occasion in which she became enlightened, in which she was free. There's a small narrative here. Some of it is opaque, but it opens up that there's young men in the world who work hard. They do certain kinds of things, and it produces results. And we have a contrast. I've been working hard. I've been doing things that I've been told to do, but I haven't had any results. She tells this story, washing my feet. I made the water useful in another way. By concentrating on it, move from the higher ground down. And this, what we can see is some kind of contemplative or meditation technique that we won't find in any meditation manual. Something that she just created for herself. That does something. In which she says, like the young men she referred to, who are living in lives of discipline, she says, I disciplined my mind, I held it back. Like a jockey on a horse. And then the story continues. I went into the hut I lived in with this lamp. It's an oil lamp. And with the needle, she raises the wick out of the oil, and it burns out. That idea of it burning out is the literal meaning of the word nirvana. That the word nirvana just means to burn out, to blow out. And so when she says, oh, the lamp blew out, and I was free, that the oil lamp went out, and her mind went out. And so she was free and enlightened in that time. In that, I would just say, it's a nice poem. And we don't need to do very much more than just read this and to see certain kinds of things that are moving in this narrative that it tells. But one of the things that we could see is that we have questions about, right in the middle, where she talks about, I washed my feet, and I made that into some kind of meditation about, and then watching it move from the higher ground down. There's other detail of why is it that I have not attained enlightenment? It's just a question that is there. One of the things that when I started to speak about, it's an oil lamp, and this is how the lamp is. You stick a needle in it. What you could say is that what we're always doing when we're reading literature, the key aspect is to read with the mind's eye. What do you see with the mind's eye? And so what you constantly have to try to do is to visualize things that are there. So one of the things that you might say to yourself is, what does the hut look like when I picture it? When she said, I went into the hut. You know, what kind of hut is it? And what is it like inside that hut? One of the things that you start to see is that the mind's eye starts to fill into things. Now, it could be that the hut is dark and it has no windows, and that's why there's a lamp. Or it could be that it's the end of the day, and she's lighting a lamp. And you start to fill in other kinds of things without really paying attention to it. But that feature of the mind's eye seeing things, starting to add other kinds of things that are there, starts to lead us to other kinds of things. And what I can tell you is that the story of Patichara is one of the great stories of the Theravada Buddhist world, at least. It is particularly well known. It is, like all great Buddhist stories, particularly tragic. And it is heartbreaking when you hear it. Now, let me just say one thing before I tell you the story. And this has to do with the theory of literature in South Asia and how to see what we see with the mind's eye. There's a great theorist of literature who wrote in around the 11th century in India in Sanskrit, a man named Numata. He takes up one small little poem that's very kind of lovely in its shortness and directness. And all it says is, look at that heron over there on the lake. It looks like a pearl on a green leaf. Now the metaphor, where you say it looks like a pearl on a green leaf, is the crooked speech. The metaphor says it's like something. And then when we start to say, well, what does it look like? We start to see that it is a white heron who is on a stagnant pond that has algae on it and is green, so it looks like a leaf. It is a heron who is hunting, therefore it is still. And that's where we get the image of a pearl on a green leaf. Numata, when he interprets this poem, what he tells us is, what this is a young woman who is telling her beloved where they're going to meet to have a tryst together. And there's other people there. And so she doesn't want other people to know that they're making an arrangement to have a meeting. But in front of them, she says, you see that heron over there? That's where we can meet. And I'll meet you there later. And no one will disturb us because that heron is so still. No one is over there. So she's saying to him, I'll see you later. Now you can say, oh,
That's pretty elaborate reading. But Numata is not happy with that. And he says, some people don't like it that way. He says, some people say that what it is a woman who is saying to her beloved that they've already arranged to meet, and she showed up, and he didn't come. And he's saying, I was there, you weren't there. And she says, that can't be true, because look at that heron over there. If you had come, he would have flown away. Therefore, we have the evidence that you didn't come. Now, both of these things, no one ever says anything about a young woman and a young man making an arrangement to meet. But what Numata is teaching us is that meaning comes from the rich imagination of context. That what we have to do is to read something and imagine it in a way and say, where would this have been spoken? That it would have meant something very, very richly. What we can see is that Buddhist readers of the poems of the first Buddhist women were doing this themselves. Every single one of these poems comes from the commentator telling a story about the woman who spoke this poem. And what all of the stories are a very elaborate and rich imagination of context. The one of Patacharas is one of the richest and most tragic. What it is a story about a young woman who falls in love with someone that is a servant in her household, and thus is an inappropriate romantic partner for her. She is in love with someone who is beneath her. Her parents do not approve. She knows that they won't approve. So she and the man that she's in love with run away so that they can establish a life together out of the love that they have for each other. They do this, and she becomes pregnant. It's a custom that when a woman is pregnant, still is today in Sri Lanka, that a woman will go back to the household of her birth to have the children there, to give birth there among people that love her and will care for her. She wants to go back to give birth in her parents' household. Her husband is against this. Says, if we go back, I will be killed. Because, this is a forbidden love. She still insists, so he says, okay, I will. But what happens is part of the beauties, the extravagances of Buddhist stories. On the way, her delivery time occurs, and she ends up giving birth to a child by the side of the road. There's no point going back to her parents' home. So she and her husband and the newborn child go back to where they were living. She becomes pregnant again. Again, she wants to go back. Again, her husband protests. Again, she insists. They set out, but now it's her pregnant, an infant, her husband. They set out, and as they're on the road, a rainstorm comes up. The husband goes into the woods, the forest on the side of the road to start to collect branches to build a hut to protect the infant and his pregnant wife from the storm that is coming. While he's out there cutting the branches, a viper, a snake, bites him and kills him. And he dies out in the forest. The storm comes up. You can almost predict this if you know Buddhist stories. The storm comes up, and what you have to expect is, of course, she's going to give birth to the child in the middle of the storm, in the night, with her husband dead in the forest. This is what happens. So that then when the dawn comes, she's given birth. She goes to look for her husband, finds his dead body, and the bite marks of the snake. At this point, she is distraught, but she needs to do something about the newborn, the infant. She proceeds on her way towards her parents' house. Because of the rain, the river that she has to cross to get to her birth village is flooded with rain. So it will be risky for her to kind of cross the river. So what she does is that she leaves the newborn on one shore and carries the infant across the river and leaves him on the other shore, and then heads back to get the newborn. When she's heading back, and in the middle of the river, a large hawk swoops down onto the newborn and picks it up to carry it away. She cries out to try to scare the hawk away from carrying away the newborn. It's ineffective. It doesn't scare the hawk off, but the infant boy, who she left on the other shore, thinks that she's calling him to come into the river, and he plunges into the river and drowns. So then what you can see is that her husband has died and both of her 2 children have died. She staggers out of the river and heads towards her village and meets a stranger on the road. And she says, the stranger says, you look terrible, what's wrong? She says, I don't have time to tell you, I'm just going to this village. And the stranger says, I just came from there, you don't want to go. And she says, why not? And he says, there was a terrible rainstorm last night, which was the one that she was caught in. And the rain was so strong that this house collapsed and killed all of the people who were living in that house. She inquires further. It turns out that the house that collapsed, that killed all the inhabitants, you can guess who it is. It's her parents' household. And so all of her siblings and her parents are now dead. The story portrays Patachara as deranged by grief, and that she is just running down the road, mad. She comes near where the Buddha is. The Buddha's disciples are embarrassed that this naked woman is coming towards the Buddha, and they throw clods of dirt at her to chase her away. One of the versions of this story in Sinhala, the medieval narrator telling the story, when he gets to this point of human beings throwing clods of dirt to chase her away, he just makes the observation, the true observation, that human beings do not know the depths of suffering in this world. And so we don't understand the suffering that others are going through, and we turn our backs on it or chase people away. The Buddha, however, can see through and tells his disciples, don't chase her away, and summons her. Come. And that's how she ordains. She comes and lives with the Buddha. You might say that the poem that we're picking up here, when she says, why have I not experienced freedom, is the voice of her living as a disciple of the Buddha. She has found a home, people who are taking care of her, but she is not free from what has driven her mad. She's still burdened by the memories of what has happened. And what we could say is she's burdened by the memories of what has happened and the guilt that she is responsible for what has happened to her. Just as an aside, I'll just tell you that the first time I ever heard anyone tell me this story was in Colombo in the 1980s, and it was a servant woman who worked in one of my neighbors' households. And when she was telling the story, throughout it, she would burst into tears and have to stop, and then would continue. It was only later that I realized that, or I learned that she had children that she had left in her own village out of poverty and was working in Colombo to earn money, but was kind of consumed by guilt that she wasn't there to take care of her children, and that something, what was happening that was bad for her children was in fact by her own fault. I'll also share with you that the story of Patachara is one of the most common stories told in Cambodia after the Khmer Rouge period, in which people were trying to make sense of what had happened to them. And this Patachara story makes you ask, am I somehow responsible for the suffering of others that I love? What happens to Patachara, and this is where we have about her washing her feet. one night she's washing her feet, and all of you who have seen water on dry ground will know that the water runs looking for wet areas. And so it seems to have a will of its own, and it just moves. The poem says from higher ground to lower ground. The story just says the water was just running on the dry ground. Some of it went a very short distance and then was absorbed by the world, by the earth. Some of it went a longer distance, then was absorbed. And the third went a much longer distance. So what you have then is that you could see in this is that what she starts to see, the rich imagination of context of reading the poem that the commentator gives, is that the water that runs a short amount of time is the infant child. It's the infant's child whose fate or destiny or karma meant it would only live a certain amount of time. The one that went a medium amount is not the newborn child, but the infant child, the toddler. The one that went a long distance is the husband. And there's a way in which you could say is that she's starting to say that, yes, I was part of what happened to them. But what happened to them wasn't my doing. I was just part of the occasion for what happened to them. Now, one of the things that we can just say in reading this is a bit unclear for the historian. Is it the case that we had this poem in which you say, while washing my feet, I made the water useful in another way by concentrating on it, move from the higher ground down. And this whole story about Patichara and her children and her husband dying is the rich imagination of making sense of that small detail in the poem. The way that the story and the poem are presented in the tradition is that this actually happened to Patichara. And that when she is telling this, that the poem is the expression of making sense of her own life experience in this way. I'll just say, following Mamata, what we want to do when we're reading poetry is to pay attention to these details about what's happening there and try to make sense of them for ourselves. So just with that story about Patichara having lost her husband, her children, her parents, her siblings, when we come back to the second verse, why have I not experienced freedom when I'm virtuous and I do what the teacher taught, when I'm not lazy and I am calm? Why am I not like these young men who plant seeds in the ground and they produce things, they get the fruits of their labors? Why don't I get it? One of the things that we might just ask ourselves, well, why would she not get the fruits of her labors based on what we know of this story? And so one of the things we could start to say, oh, we can see with our mind's eye, we can start to add other things into this, in which we start to see is that grief can be a very, very powerful thing that we can't just throw off from ourselves. And that what we start to have in this is another way of thinking about, oh, this is how Buddhists were thinking about the religious life in this poetry, early Buddhists, that they were very realist about the troubles that human beings had to face. And they didn't have any kind of simple idea, if I did this, this automatically is going to happen. But that they were quite willing to face in a very cold-eyed way. Life is very, very hard for many, many people. And one of the things that we have to do is, in some sense, to allow ourselves to live through that hardness. The other thing that we could say is, for me, a very striking and small and wonderful detail. That first line, the young men, they plow fields, they sow seeds, they take care, they get the fruits of their labors. They find wealth. Say that someone joining the monastic order, someone entering into the religious life as a lay person, starting to meditate, starting to practice in serious kinds of ways, one of the things you start to say, I'm expecting it to have fruits of my labor. I want to have benefits. That's why I'm doing this. The poem is very frank. It may not happen. It might not happen the way that you want it to happen. It's not so simple as young men finding wealth. And so it just has that thing there. And then the interesting detail, what we can imagine about Patachara, she's found a home, she's ordained, she's living in the Buddhist circle, and nothing's happening. She's working very hard. We might imagine in reading it that a temptation to, I want to give up. What's the point of this? And then this accidental moment that she's washing her feet, she's doing something else, and then it presents itself. That's what the world is like. It's this kind of surprising vision that not, oh, if I just open up this book, follow these instructions, follow what someone tells me, automatically it's going to happen. It says it's not going to happen that way. It's going to be in a very surprising and sudden way. One of the things that, say, for a historian of Buddhist life, what we start to see is that Buddhists are quite often interested in, does it happen suddenly? This freedom that we're pursuing, does it happen almost on its own without us having any intent of it, that it's not so mechanical? Or does it depend on a lot of labor and things that are that we're putting a lot of effort in? But one of the things that we could have in this is that just those two small meditations. I was washing my feet and I watched the water and I turned it to another use. It's a meditation topic that's there, but not in any manual. Then fixing the wick of the lamp, that what you have in it is that something that she's doing every night. But this night it turns into something really quite different. So that what you have then is, for me in the poem, that comes from this rich imagination of context of this extravagant story of Patachara, that I'll just say, having heard many, many, particularly women, telling the story over and over, in which they would say, my life is like Patachara's. I feel responsible for things that I don't know how I was responsible for. But in that extravagant story, what you have is this kind of happiness over the surprising possibilities of life, of what's something that will emerge in ways that we can't anticipate, we can't teach someone else. We just have to be prepared and waiting for that to occur in this way. Now, what I'm going to ask is that we take a tea break. It will be good for my voice. It will also break me from the habit of talking too much. And then we'll, in some sense, practice a little bit together of some other ways of reading the poetry together. To just say, to just encourage you on this is that the key to reading these poems is not knowing a lot about Buddhism. It's about having a good imagination. And to keep on watching, what does my eye see when I see things? And that's where I just would encourage you. Just try to pay attention to yourself. When I said, she went into the hut, what did the hut look like? How big was it? What was inside it? And one of the details you might ask yourself is, what color is her hair in this? And so it's all those things where you're just asking, what am I seeing before I know that I'm seeing? And it's paying attention to that. What we say, that's what poetry does to us. It makes us see things with the use of words before we know that we're seeing things. And you say, I never realized that I thought of her. You might say, does she have her head shaved? Does she have gray hair? Does she have black hair? Is it long? Is it kind of just a fuzz on her head? Something like that. And all of those things you start to say, a whole story is built into. One of the things might be, if you say her hair is gray, she's been living a long time not making any progress. And then that said, why don't I make any progress? Becomes very, very anguished. And one of the things that you say, it comes out of just that detail. Her hair is gray. And that's one of the things. And you say, well, why would I think that she's gray? Her hair is gray. And I would say, because she's an elder and she's a teacher to other people. So that, of course, she might be older than the other women. All right, with that, release you to a tea break and also to my voice as well.